Chapter 1. The day time felt heavy. The day began like any other. No alarms, no urgency, just the quiet vibration of my phone on the nightstand, a soft reminder lighting up the screen before fading away. I reached for it without thinking, more out of habit than interest. A calendar notification disappeared as soon as I tapped it. Birthday. I stared at the blank screen longer than necessary, waiting for something to rise inside me. Gratitude, surprise, even discomfort. But nothing came. Just a flat awareness, like noticing the weather without caring what it meant. The room was still. Morning light rested gently on the walls, revealing nothing new. The same furniture, the same small signs of a life that looked complete from the outside. I sat up slowly, feeling the weight of my body settle into the moment. Nothing hurt, nothing felt wrong, and yet something felt late. I moved through the morning routine with practiced ease. Shower, coffee, a glance out the window. The street below was already alive, cars moving with purpose, people walking with intention. Everyone seemed to know where they were going. I didn't. That realization didn't scare me at first. It just lingered. I sat at the kitchen table, coffee cooling untouched, watching steam disappear into the air. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was thick, heavy in a way I couldn't explain. There was no crisis waiting for me, no argument from the night before, no bad news on my phone. By all visible measures, life was stable. But stability had started to feel like a pause button pressed too long. I thought about the years behind me, not as memories, but as blocks of time, segments filled with preparation, planning, and patience. I had always told myself I was waiting for the right moment, waiting to feel ready, waiting for clarity, waiting for confidence to arrive on its own. Waiting had felt responsible, mature, sensible. Until it didn't. The unease crept in slowly, like a question asked too quietly to ignore. What exactly had I been waiting for? I looked around the apartment. Nothing here reflected urgency or passion. Everything was functional, acceptable, neutral. A space designed to maintain, not to grow. I realized then that time hadn't rushed past me. It had waited. Patiently, and I had let it. I checked my phone again, scrolling without purpose. Messages from people who meant well. Short greetings, polite words. No one asked how I was really doing, and I wasn't sure I knew how to answer if they did. I thought about the last time I felt fully present in my own life. Not productive, not busy. Present. That absence hit harder than I expected. I wasn't afraid of getting older. The number itself didn't bother me. Age had never felt like a threat. What unsettled me was the quiet accumulation of delays, the conversations I planned to have later, the risks I intended to take someday, the version of myself I kept postponing. I had been living in preparation mode for so long that I forgot to arrive. The day moved forward, but I stayed still. I ran errands, answered emails, completed tasks that needed to be done. Everything functioned as it should, but each action felt slightly disconnected, like I was watching myself from a distance. It occurred to me that waiting doesn't announce itself as loss. It disguises itself as patience, as responsibility, as being realistic. I had told myself I was being careful, that timing mattered, that rushing would lead to regret. And yet, here I was, surrounded by caution, carrying a different kind of regret. Not for what I had done, but for what I kept delaying. The evening arrived quietly. No plans, no celebration, just the soft glow of streetlights filtering through the window. I sat on the couch, the day settling around me like a question without an answer. The silence felt louder at night, more honest. That's when the thought finally formed clearly, without panic or drama. I wasn't afraid of getting older. I was afraid of how much I had postponed. The sentence landed with a weight I couldn't shake. I saw how waiting had become my default response to uncertainty. Instead of choosing, I paused. Instead of risking, I delayed. I convinced myself that time was a resource I could manage. But time doesn't ask for permission. It moves, whether you do or not. I felt the truth of that in my chest, not as fear, but as recognition, like finally seeing a pattern that had been there all along. This wasn't a moment of collapse. Nothing dramatic was happening, but something fundamental had shifted. The unease I felt wasn't a warning of disaster. It was an invitation, an awareness that life doesn't require chaos to slip by unnoticed, that waiting can quietly hollow out the days if left unchallenged. I didn't know what I was going to change. I didn't know where to begin. All I knew was that something inside me had awakened to the cost of standing still. And once you see that, it's impossible to unsee. The night settled in, calm and unremarkable. But I knew even then that the weight I felt wasn't exhaustion. It was time finally making itself known. Chapter 2. Living on Not Yet. I didn't notice it happening at first. There was no decision where I consciously chose to delay my life, no moment where I said, I will wait instead of live. It happened quietly, through habits that felt reasonable and choices that felt safe. My life became structured around not yet confident enough, not yet stable enough, not yet the right time. Each delay came with a logical explanation. Each pause sounded mature when I said it out loud. I told myself I was being careful, that patience was a virtue, that rushing would only lead to mistakes. Waiting felt responsible. I had a job that paid the bills, not exciting, but reliable. I showed up on time. I did what was expected. I told myself I was lucky to have stability in a world that didn't always offer it. I had relationships that were polite and functional. Conversations stayed on the surface. We talked about schedules, responsibilities, plans that never quite moved beyond talk. From the outside, my life looked calm, reasonable, predictable. People would say things like, "You're doing fine," or "At least you're steady," and I would nod, accepting their assessment. I didn't correct them. I didn't even question it. Fine became my identity. Inside, though, something was slowly fading. I woke up each morning without anticipation. The days blended together, marked only by obligations. I moved from one task to the next without resistance, but without engagement either. There was no urgency, no spark, just a low-level exhaustion that never fully went away. I kept telling myself I was waiting for confidence, that one day I would wake up feeling ready, ready to take a risk, ready to speak honestly, ready to choose something that felt like mine. Confidence, I believed, was something that arrived before action. So I waited. I waited for stability too. I told myself I couldn't make changes until everything was secure, until I had enough saved, until the timing was perfect. The timing never was. There was always another reason to delay, another responsibility to consider, another voice in my head reminding me to be sensible. Waiting became a pattern, and the pattern became my life. I didn't feel sad all the time. That's what made it confusing. Sadness at least feels like something. What I felt was flatter than that, muted, like watching my life through a pane of glass. I laughed at the right moments. I nodded at the right times. I said yes when it was easier than explaining no. I didn't feel miserable. I felt absent. Sometimes, in quiet moments, I noticed a distance between who I was and who I felt I could be. But I pushed that awareness away quickly. I told myself it was unrealistic, that everyone feels this way sometimes, that adulthood meant compromise. The numbness grew slowly, almost politely. It didn't demand attention, it just settled in. I stopped asking myself what I wanted because the question felt impractical. Wants felt childish, needs felt selfish. Waiting, on the other hand, felt neutral, safe. I waited for permission that never came, permission to change direction, permission to disappoint people, permission to want more without a clear justification. I told myself I needed approval before acting, even though no one had asked me to wait. The truth was uncomfortable. I was using responsibility as a shield. Waiting protected me from failure, from judgment, from the possibility of choosing wrong. It also protected me from choosing at all. People around me moved forward in small ways: new jobs, new cities, new chapters. I congratulated them sincerely, but something twisted quietly inside me. Not envy exactly, resentment mixed with confusion. Why did it seem so easy for them to move while I remained suspended? I told myself our situations were different, that they had advantages I didn't, that I was being prudent. Deep down, I knew that wasn't the full truth. I wasn't stuck because I couldn't move. I was stuck because I kept postponing the discomfort of moving. The longer I waited, the harder it became to imagine starting. The gap between intention and action widened until it felt unbridgeable. Waiting began to feel permanent. And still, nothing was technically wrong. That was the part that haunted me. I wasn't struggling visibly. I wasn't failing in obvious ways. I wasn't in crisis. Nothing was wrong. And that was the problem, because nothing pushed me to change. I realized how easy it is to lose years that way, not through disaster, but through comfort, through routines that dull the edges of desire. Time passed gently, without resistance, and I let it. I had built a life that required maintenance, not courage, a life that rewarded consistency, not honesty. The emotional distance became familiar. I learned how to operate within it, how to ignore the quiet ache that surfaced when I allowed myself to think too deeply. Weighing numbed that ache temporarily, but it never removed it. There were moments, small ones, when the weight of delay pressed heavier than usual. Late nights, long drives, brief flashes of clarity. I would tell myself, soon. Soon I'll make a change. Soon I'll feel ready. Soon I'll stop waiting. Soon became a moving target, and each time I pushed it forward, something inside me retreated further. Living on not yet didn't look like fear from the outside. It looked like patience, like maturity. But inside, it felt like standing in a doorway without ever stepping through. I began to sense that waiting wasn't neutral. It was active. It was shaping me, quietly teaching me to minimize my own desires, to stay small, to accept a life that fit expectations, but not my inner truth. That realization didn't lead to immediate action, but it did something important. It made the numbness visible. And once I could see it, I could no longer pretend that waiting was harmless. The life I was living wasn't wrong, but it wasn't fully mine either. And somewhere beneath the layers of responsibility and delay, a question started to form. Soft at first, but persistent. How long can you wait before waiting becomes the thing that defines you? The answer didn't come yet, but the silence around it grew heavier, and I felt for the first time that not yet was slowly turning into never if I didn't pay attention. Chapter 3: The Dream That Never Left. I wasn't looking for it. That's what surprised me most. The notebook was buried in a box I hadn't opened in years, tucked behind old documents and things I kept only because throwing them away felt like admitting something was over. I had pulled the box out for a practical reason, looking for a receipt, I think. But when I lifted the lid, my eyes went straight to it. A thin, worn notebook. The cover was faded, the edges bent. I recognized it instantly, even before I touched it. My hand hovered for a moment, as if the object might disappear if I acknowledged it too quickly. I picked it up slowly. The weight was familiar. Inside were pages filled with handwriting that looked both mine and not mine anymore. Neater, more hopeful. Words written without hesitation, without apology. Plans, ideas, sentences that began with one day and ended with certainty. I sat down on the floor without realizing I had done it. The room felt smaller suddenly, quieter in a way that pressed inward. I turned the pages carefully, as if they were fragile. Each one carried a version of me I hadn't thought about in a long time. Not younger exactly, just less careful. I remembered how it felt to write those words, the energy behind them, the belief that time was generous and that effort would naturally lead somewhere meaningful. I had forgotten how clear that voice was. A wave of something moved through me. At first it felt like nostalgia, then embarrassment, then something sharper. Shame. I closed the notebook halfway, my thumb still holding my place. For a moment, I wanted to put it back, to return it to the box and pretend I hadn't seen it, because looking at it made something undeniable. The dream was still there. It hadn't faded, it hadn't been replaced, it hadn't been proven unrealistic, it had simply been untouched. That realization hurt more than I expected. I had told myself stories over the years, stories about growing up, about priorities shifting, about life demanding compromise. I had convinced myself that letting go was a sign of maturity. But this wasn't letting go. This was abandonment disguised as reason. I hadn't failed the dream. Failure implies effort, risk, and loss. What I had done was quieter. I had postponed it, again and again, until postponement became permanent. The shame didn't come from wanting the dream again. It came from realizing I never truly stopped wanting it. I had just learned how to ignore the want. I sat there longer than I meant to, reading lines I once believed without question, goals that felt too big now, ideas that felt naive only because I hadn't given them a chance to grow. I wondered when hope had turned into something embarrassing, when ambition started to feel irresponsible. I thought about how often I had said things like, "That's not realistic anymore," or "That phase is over," without ever testing whether it was true. I had retired my dream without a conversation. That thought settled heavily. I didn't fail my dream. I abandoned it politely. The sentence formed clearly, without anger, just clarity. Politely meant without drama, without conflict, without admitting what I was doing. I abandoned it with logic, with excuses that sounded convincing even to me. I told myself I was being practical, that the timing was wrong, that other things mattered more. And maybe they did, but not at the cost I paid. I realized then that the numbness I had been living with wasn't random. It wasn't exhaustion. It was the quiet grief of leaving something unfinished. Grief without closure. I felt it in my chest, not as pain, but as pressure, like something that had been waiting patiently to be acknowledged. The dream hadn't left me. I had walked away from it, carefully, so carefully that I barely noticed I was gone. I closed the notebook fully and held it against my knees. The room felt different now, charged, not with urgency, but with awareness. I wasn't suddenly inspired. I didn't feel motivated. I didn't start making plans. What I felt was recognition. I could no longer tell myself the dream was dead. That lie had kept me comfortable. It allowed me to live without confronting regret. Now that comfort was gone. And strangely, so was some of the numbness. In its place was something quieter, but more honest, a sense of responsibility. Not obligation, responsibility. Not to achieve the dream, but to stop pretending it never mattered. I thought about how many years I had spent telling myself it was too late, how that belief had hardened without ever being questioned. Too late compared to what? Compared to whom? I realized how often I had used time as an excuse, when really it was fear. Fear of starting without certainty. Fear of discovering I wasn't as capable as I once believed. Waiting had protected me from that discovery, but it also cost me connection with myself. The awareness didn't feel like a call to action. It felt like a crack in the wall I had built around that part of me, small but irreversible. Once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. I put the notebook back in the box, but not the way it had been before. I placed it on top this time, visible, accessible. I didn't know what I would do with it, but I knew I wouldn't bury it again. As I stood up, I noticed something subtle but important. The day felt different, not lighter, not easier, just more real. The numbness hadn't disappeared, but it no longer felt complete. Something had interrupted it. A memory, a truth, a version of myself that refused to stay silent any longer. I understood then that awareness was the beginning of discomfort, and discomfort, unlike numbness, meant I was still alive inside my own story. The dream hadn't left. It had been waiting, and now that I had finally looked at it honestly, I knew that waiting, like all the others, was no longer neutral. Something had shifted. The question was no longer whether the dream mattered. It was whether I was willing to keep pretending it didn't. Chapter 4. The Costs of Playing It Safe. For a long time, I believed I was doing the right thing. I chose predictability over possibility, not because I lacked imagination, but because predictability felt responsible. It came with fewer questions, fewer raised eyebrows, fewer risks that might expose uncertainty I wasn't prepared to explain. Each choice made sense on its own. Stay where you are, it's stable. Don't change too much, you have obligations. Wait, this isn't the right time. When repeated often enough, those choices formed a life. A careful one. I told myself that playing it safe was a sign of maturity, that wanting security meant I had grown up. I compared myself to my younger self and felt proud of how measured I had become. I didn't chase unrealistic dreams anymore. I didn't take unnecessary risks. I didn't disrupt the balance I had worked to maintain. From the outside, it looked admirable. From the inside, it felt increasingly narrow. I noticed it in small moments. When someone talked about taking a leap, moving cities, changing careers, starting something uncertain, I listened politely, nodded at the right places, offered encouragement. But inside, something tightened. It wasn't jealousy exactly. It was a quiet resentment mixed with confusion. Why did they get to move forward while I stayed still? I tried to answer that question honestly. I told myself they had different circumstances, different resources, different tolerance for risk. Those explanations worked for a while. Then they didn't, because the resentment wasn't really about them. It was about me, about the choices I had made repeatedly without questioning whether they still served me, about how often I had framed avoidance as wisdom. I began to see how safety had become my identity. I was the reliable one, the reasonable one, the person who didn't rock the boat. People trusted me because I was consistent, predictable, steady. I took pride in that. But consistency came at a cost I hadn't accounted for. It required silence. Silence about dissatisfaction, silence about restlessness, silence about the quiet desire for something more. I carried that silence carefully, like a responsibility. I reminded myself of what I had to be grateful for. I listed the ways my life was easier than it could have been. Gratitude kept me in line, and bitterness grew beside it. I felt guilty for wanting more, guilty for feeling unfulfilled when nothing was obviously wrong. I told myself it was selfish to expect excitement, meaning, or alignment when so many people struggled just to get by. That guilt kept me from asking harder questions. It kept me playing safe long after safety stopped feeling like enough. I noticed how often I dismissed my own impulses, ideas that surfaced briefly before being shut down, thoughts that began with, "What if?" and ended with, "That's not realistic." I didn't argue with myself anymore. I had learned how to silence desire quickly and efficiently. That efficiency impressed others. It hollowed me out. The resentment toward people who moved forward stayed quiet, but it lingered. It appeared in fleeting thoughts I didn't like to admit. They're reckless. They'll regret it. They're lucky. Those judgments protected me from facing a harder truth. They were choosing movement. I was choosing comfort. Not comfort as ease, but comfort as familiarity, as known boundaries, as outcomes I could predict even if I didn't love them. Playing it safe reduced anxiety. It also reduced possibility. I felt the tension between gratitude and bitterness more clearly as time went on. I could appreciate what I had while simultaneously feeling trapped by it. That contradiction exhausted me. I couldn't complain without feeling ungrateful. I couldn't want more without feeling irresponsible. I learned to live inside that tension, balancing it carefully so no one noticed the strain. But strain accumulates. Emotional debt doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It compounds quietly, building pressure beneath a surface that looks calm. I paid that debt with numbness, with distance from my own desires, with indifference toward my own future. I told myself this was adulthood, that everyone eventually settles into something smaller than they imagined, that ambition fades for a reason. But the truth was harder to accept. My ambition hadn't faded. It had been suppressed. The cost of playing it safe wasn't immediate. It didn't demand attention. It waited patiently, collecting interest year after year. The cost was waking up without excitement. It was making decisions without conviction. It was feeling out of place in my own life. The cost was watching time pass while telling myself I was doing the smart thing. I began to realize that safety, when chosen repeatedly without reflection, can become a cage, a comfortable one, a socially acceptable one, but a cage nonetheless. That realization didn't push me into action yet. It made me uneasy. And unease, unlike numbness, has direction. It pointed inward, toward the choices I had made and the reasons behind them. It asked questions I had avoided by staying busy and responsible. What am I protecting? Who am I trying not to disappoint? What am I afraid will happen if I stop playing safe? I didn't answer those questions right away, but I felt the weight of them. The cost of playing it safe wasn't dramatic failure. It was the slow erosion of alignment. And for the first time, I couldn't pretend that erosion was harmless. Something was building, not urgency, but pressure, and I sensed that ignoring it any longer would require more effort than facing it ever had. Chapter 5. The night regret spoke clearly. The night didn't arrive with drama. It came the way nights usually do, quietly, without announcement. The light outside dimmed, the sounds softened. The world settled into itself. I was alone. Not in a tragic sense, no tears yet, no shaking hands, just the familiar stillness of my apartment, the kind I had grown used to filling with noise or distraction. That night, I didn't. I sat on the couch with the lights off, letting the dark remain untouched. The glow from the street outside slipped through the window and rested on the floor in thin lines. I watched them slowly shift as time passed. There had been no argument that day, no bad news, no final straw. That was what made it harder. Nothing had triggered the feeling. It simply arrived, heavy and complete, as if it had been waiting patiently for a moment when I could no longer avoid it. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, staring at the floor. My body felt tired in a way sleep wouldn't fix. Not exhaustion, something deeper, a weight. I thought about the years behind me, not as memories, but as distance, time that had moved whether I had engaged with it or not, seasons that had passed without leaving a mark. The room felt smaller as the realization settled in. I hadn't lost those years to chaos or failure. There had been no dramatic collapse, no reckless mistakes, no obvious wrong turns. That was the problem. I had been careful. Careful with my choices, careful with my expectations, careful with myself. And yet, here I was, sitting in the quiet, feeling the accumulated costs of all that care. I pressed my palms together, not in prayer, but in an attempt to ground myself. My breath felt shallow, controlled. I noticed how often I did that, controlled my breath, my reactions, my desires. I had learned how to hold myself together so well that I forgot what it felt like to let anything through. That night, something broke through anyway. It wasn't loud, it was steady. The weight of years arrived all at once, not as images or specific regrets, but as an understanding that settled deep in my chest. I hadn't been waiting for opportunity. I had been waiting to feel ready. The sentence formed slowly, then clearly. I didn't waste time doing nothing. I wasted it waiting to feel ready. The truth of it hit me harder than I expected. I felt my throat tighten, my eyes burn, not with the urge to cry dramatically, but with the kind of emotion that doesn't need expression to be real. I had convinced myself that readiness was something that arrived before action, that one day I would wake up confident, certain, unafraid. That day never came. Because readiness doesn't arrive on its own. I had been waiting for permission from a future version of myself that didn't exist. I sat there, letting the realization settle fully. I didn't rush to soften it. I didn't look for a comforting explanation. I let it hurt. The pain wasn't sharp. It was dull and expansive, spreading through me as I acknowledged how many moments I had postponed, how many decisions I had delayed under the belief that timing was everything. Timing mattered, but I had used it as a shield. I thought about the opportunities I had dismissed because they felt inconvenient, the conversations I hadn't initiated because they felt uncomfortable, the risks I hadn't taken because they felt premature. I hadn't said no, I had said not yet, over and over. The quiet breakdown wasn't about self-blame. I didn't feel anger towards myself. I felt grief. Grief for a version of life that had been deferred so long it no longer felt real. Grief for the courage I had assumed would appear without effort. I realized how deeply I had misunderstood growth. I had treated readiness as a prerequisite when it was actually a byproduct. You don't feel ready, then act. You act, and readiness follows, slowly, unevenly, imperfectly. That truth had been available to me all along. I had just chosen waiting instead. I leaned back against the couch and closed my eyes. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel everything without categorizing it or explaining it away. Sadness, regret, relief. Relief surprised me. Admitting the truth lifted a pressure I hadn't known I was carrying. The clarity didn't fix anything, but it removed the fog. I wasn't broken. I wasn't incapable. I was simply someone who had waited too long for a feeling that was never meant to lead. The realization didn't come with instructions. There was no plan attached to it, no immediate sense of what to do next. But it changed how I saw the past. The years weren't wasted because I had done nothing. They were wasted because I had done only what felt safe enough. I opened my eyes and looked around the room again. It was the same space, same furniture, same silence. But I wasn't avoiding it anymore. I sat with the discomfort until it softened into something else. Not motivation, not hope, but honesty. That honesty felt like a turning point, even if nothing outwardly changed. The breakdown remained quiet. No sobbing, no collapse to the floor. Just a steady acknowledgement of loss and responsibility. That night didn't end with a decision. It ended with acceptance. Acceptance that waiting had been a choice. Acceptance that readiness had been an illusion. Acceptance that regret, when faced honestly, could become information instead of punishment. As I finally stood up and turned off the last light, I felt drained but clear. The collapse hadn't destroyed me. It had revealed something I could no longer ignore. And in that revelation, I sensed, without certainty, without urgency, that the way I related to time would never be the same again. Chapter 6. The question that changed everything. The question didn't arrive in a dramatic moment. It came quietly, the way truth often does, when the noise finally settles and there's nothing left to distract you from your own thoughts. I was standing in the kitchen early one morning, waiting for the kettle to boil. The light outside was soft, unfinished. The day hadn't decided what it would be yet. Neither had I. I leaned against the counter, staring at nothing in particular, when the thought surfaced, fully formed, calm and direct. If nothing changes, will I still be here in 5 years, waiting? The question didn't scare me. It didn't accuse me. It didn't demand an immediate answer. It simply existed, steady and unavoidable. I turned it over slowly, the way you examine something fragile to understand its shape. I didn't rush to dismiss it. I didn't argue with it. For the first time, I let the question stay. 5 years. I pictured it not as an abstract future, but as an extension of the present. The same routines, the same delays, the same internal negotiations that always ended in postponement. The image wasn't tragic. It was familiar. And that familiarity unsettled me more than any imagined disaster could have. I realized then that my regret wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the future repeating itself without resistance. The insight landed gently but firmly. Waiting hadn't just happened to me. I had chosen it. Not once, but repeatedly. That realization could have turned into self-blame. I felt the edge of it approaching, the temptation to judge my past self harshly. I didn't. Anger wouldn't help here. I thought about who I was back then, tired, cautious, trying to protect myself with the tools I had. Waiting had felt like the safest option available. I could acknowledge that without excusing the cost. Acceptance didn't mean approval. It meant honesty. I hadn't been unlucky. I hadn't been incapable. I had been choosing delay because it felt less threatening than action. The clarity that followed wasn't loud. It didn't bring relief or excitement. It brought responsibility. Responsibility without punishment. I understood then that regret loses its power when it's no longer paired with denial. When you stop arguing with what happened and start listening to what it's telling you. The question stayed with me as the day unfolded. If nothing changes, it followed me through ordinary moments, walking down the street, sitting at my desk, listening to conversations that skimmed the surface of things that mattered. The question didn't demand that everything change. It asked whether I was willing to let nothing change. That distinction mattered. I realized how often I had framed my life as something that happened to me. Circumstances, timing, expectations, external pressures. All of that was real, but it wasn't the whole story. Waiting had been my response, and response implies choice. That understanding shifted something fundamental inside me. I didn't feel guilty. I felt capable. Not in the confident, energized way people talk about, but in a quieter, steadier sense. Capable of deciding differently, even if I didn't yet know how. I began to see how much power I had given away by treating waiting as neutral, by telling myself it was just a phase, just caution, just how things were. Waiting was an action. So was continuing it. That realization stripped the situation of drama and left behind something more useful. Agency. Agency didn't mean everything would suddenly be easy. It meant I couldn't pretend anymore. I thought about how often I had waited for clarity before acting, as if clarity were a prerequisite rather than a result. I saw now how that belief had kept me suspended indefinitely. The question didn't demand that I leap. It asked that I stop standing still. I didn't make any decisions that day. I didn't write a plan or commit to change. That wasn't what the moment required. What it required was acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that 5 years from now wasn't some distant abstraction. It was built from the same choices I was making now or avoiding now. I felt a strange calm settle in after that realization. Not peace exactly, more like alignment, the feeling that something inside me had shifted into place. I wasn't trapped by my past. I was responsible for my future. That responsibility felt heavy, but it also felt fair. I stopped asking myself why I hadn't changed sooner. The better question was whether I was willing to change now. The absence of anger surprised me. I had expected regret to come with self-criticism, with harsh internal language. Instead, it came with clarity. I saw my waiting clearly for what it was, not cowardice, not laziness, but a coping strategy that had outlived its usefulness. It had protected me once, now it was limiting me. Understanding that didn't require punishment, it required choice. The question stayed with me into the evening, softer now, less insistent, but still present. If nothing changes. I knew the answer. Yes, I would still be here, waiting. And knowing that, really knowing it, changed how the present felt. Time no longer seemed like something that was slipping away unnoticed. It felt like something I was actively shaping, whether I engaged with it or not. The moral twist wasn't that I had done something wrong. It was that I had more control than I wanted to admit. That truth didn't overwhelm me. It grounded me. Because control, even when uncomfortable, is preferable to confusion. As I went to bed that night, I didn't feel resolved. I felt aware. And awareness, I was beginning to understand, was the beginning of responsibility. Not responsibility to become someone else, but responsibility to stop waiting for permission to be myself. The question had changed everything, not by demanding answers, but by removing excuses. And once excuses are gone, something else takes their place. Choice. Chapter 7. Choosing late is still choosing. I didn't wake up one morning feeling brave. There was no surge of confidence, no internal speech that convinced me I was ready to begin. If anything, I felt more exposed than ever. Awareness had stripped away my excuses, but it hadn't replaced them with certainty. What it gave me instead was a narrow path forward, small enough to step onto without collapsing under expectation. The first change I made was almost invisible. I said no to something I would have automatically agreed to before. No explanation, no apology layered with justification, just a quiet refusal that felt awkward in my mouth. My heart raced afterward, as if I had done something reckless. Nothing happened. The world didn't react. No one punished me. No doors slammed shut. That surprised me. I began to notice how often I had acted as if every choice carried permanent consequences, how that belief had kept me paralyzed, afraid to move unless I could see the outcome clearly. Now, I moved without clarity, and it felt humiliating. I applied for things I wasn't fully qualified for. I spoke honestly when asked what I was working on, even when the answer sounded unfinished. I allowed myself to begin conversations I didn't know how to end. Each action carried discomfort. Fear didn't disappear. It followed me closely, whispering familiar warnings. That I was behind, that I was embarrassing myself, that starting now only highlighted how late it was. I listened, and then I acted anyway. That was new. I wasn't trying to silence fear. I was learning to move alongside it, to treat it as information, not instruction. The relief came slowly, not as excitement, but as a loosening, a softening around the edges of my days. I slept a little better. I felt less tense in ordinary moments. I noticed myself breathing more deeply, without effort. I understood then that growth didn't feel like progress at first. It felt like exposure. Choosing late stripped away the illusion of preparedness. There was no pretending I was ahead, no convincing myself I had everything figured out. Honesty replaced image. That honesty was uncomfortable, but clean. I stopped waiting to feel confident before acting. Confidence, I learned, wasn't a prerequisite. It was something that followed movement, not something that preceded it. Starting late felt humiliating until it felt honest. That sentence stayed with me, not as a mantra, but as a truth I returned to when doubt surfaced. There were days when I questioned everything again, days when the weight of comparison returned unexpectedly. I would see someone younger, more accomplished, further along, and feel the familiar tightening in my chest. On those days, I didn't push the feeling away. I acknowledged it. Then I reminded myself of something important. Choosing late was still choosing. It meant I hadn't surrendered. It meant I was responding to my life instead of observing it from a distance. I took small steps that didn't look impressive to anyone else. I focused on consistency instead of outcomes. I committed to showing up imperfectly rather than waiting for the right conditions. The fear remained, but it changed shape. It became quieter, less convincing. It stopped pretending to be wisdom. I learned how to recognize the difference between caution and avoidance, between patience and delay, between responsibility and fear dressed up as responsibility. That distinction mattered. I stopped demanding certainty from myself. I allowed trial and error to exist without interpreting it as failure. Mistakes didn't derail me. They grounded me. Each imperfect attempt reinforced something I had forgotten. I was capable of learning. That realization didn't come with pride. It came with relief. Relief that I didn't have to get everything right. Relief that starting now wasn't invalidated by not starting sooner. I began to treat my life less like a performance and more like a process, something unfolding in real time without guarantees. That shift softened my relationship with time. I no longer saw it as something I had wasted beyond repair. I saw it as something I was finally participating in. Late, maybe, but present. I noticed how the quiet empowerment didn't announce itself. It didn't demand recognition. It showed up in subtle ways, in the steadiness of my decisions, in the way I handled setbacks, in the absence of constant self-judgment. I was no longer negotiating with my future self. I was acting as myself. That felt different. There were moments when the old urge to wait resurfaced, when hesitation felt tempting, familiar. In those moments, I didn't shame myself. I reminded myself that waiting was once a strategy, one that made sense when I didn't know how to move. Now, I knew enough to take a step, even if it was late, even if it was awkward, even if no one noticed. The growth wasn't dramatic. It was steady. I wasn't chasing transformation. I was building tolerance for uncertainty, for discomfort, for honesty. That tolerance became the foundation of everything else. I didn't feel ahead. I didn't feel behind either. I felt aligned. And alignment, I realized, mattered more than timing ever had. Choosing late didn't erase the past. It didn't justify the years I had waited. But it did something more important. It changed the direction of the present. And that was enough to keep going. Quietly. Deliberately. Without waiting for permission anymore. Chapter 8. I didn't miss my life. I delayed it. I used to think my life had passed me by, that it had slipped through my hands quietly while I was busy preparing for it. That somewhere along the way, I had missed the moment when everything was supposed to begin. That belief carried weight. It followed me into quiet mornings and empty evenings. It shaped how I looked at the past with disappointment and how I looked at the future with hesitation. But that belief wasn't true. Life hadn't been stolen from me. Time hadn't been wasted beyond repair. What I had done was delay. And understanding that difference changed everything. Delay implies intention, even when it's unconscious. It means I was present, just hesitant, engaged but cautious, alive even when I felt disconnected from myself. I hadn't been absent from my life. I had been waiting beside it. That realization softened something deep inside me. I began to look back at the years I once labeled as lost and see them differently. Not as empty time, but as time filled with learning I didn't yet know how to name. Waiting taught me awareness. It taught me how to listen to discomfort instead of numbing it, how to recognize the difference between safety and stagnation, how to sit with uncertainty long enough to understand what it was asking of me. Those years weren't meaningless. They were quiet. And quiet years don't announce their purpose while you're living them. They reveal it later. I stopped framing my story as a failure to begin on time. I let go of the imaginary timeline I had been measuring myself against, the one that said certain things should have happened earlier, more smoothly, more impressively. That timeline had never been mine. When I released it, I felt lighter. Not because everything made sense, but because I no longer needed it to. I understood then that starting late didn't mean starting from behind. It meant starting with clarity. I wasn't driven by panic anymore. I wasn't trying to catch up or prove anything. I was moving because I chose to move. That choice mattered more than timing ever could. I noticed how my relationship with the present changed once I stopped resenting the past. Moments felt fuller, not louder or more exciting, just more real. I was there for them. I didn't rush through conversations or days. I allowed pauses. I allowed uncertainty. I allowed myself to be unfinished without interpreting that as failure. Waiting had taught me patience. Beginning had taught me courage, and both had a place in my story. I stopped asking myself how different my life would be if I had started sooner. That question only led backward. It didn't offer insight, it offered regrets dressed up as curiosity. The better question was simpler. What am I doing now? That question kept me grounded. It returned me to the only moments that could actually change anything, the present. I didn't need to erase my years of waiting to justify beginning. Those years had shaped how I began. They gave me depth, perspective, a quieter kind of strength. I wasn't starting from nothing. I was starting from understanding. That understanding didn't make the future predictable. It didn't guarantee success or clarity or ease. What it gave me was presence. I was no longer standing on the sidelines of my own life, waiting to feel prepared. I was participating, imperfectly, deliberately, honestly. That was enough. I looked at the life ahead of me without urgency, not because time no longer mattered, but because I no longer feared it. Time wasn't my enemy. Avoidance had been, and avoidance lost its power the moment I named it. I saw now that regret doesn't come from starting late. It comes from continuing to wait after you know you're ready to move. Readiness, I had learned, isn't a feeling. It's a decision. I made peace with the years I had delayed. I didn't celebrate them. I didn't romanticize them. I accepted them. They were part of the path that led me here, awake, responsible, and willing. Willing to begin without guarantees, willing to be seen while learning, willing to choose action over comfort. That willingness changed how I measured my life. I stopped asking myself whether I was behind. I started asking whether I was honest. Honest with my time, honest with my choices, honest with myself. That honesty became my compass. As I moved forward, I carried no illusion that everything would be easy. Difficulty didn't scare me anymore. What scared me was returning to waiting, to letting days pass without engagement. I knew now what that cost felt like, and I wasn't willing to pay it again. My story didn't end with a dramatic transformation. There was no sudden success, no clear resolution. What it ended with was something quieter and more durable. Presence. I was here. Not ahead, not behind. Here. And that was enough to continue. The years I spent waiting didn't define me. The moment I began did. I wasted years waiting, but I didn't waste the moment I finally began.